Episode 77. Whiskey pulls alongside rum. Adventures and Economies of 18th Century Distilled Liquors. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how America is going to transform from the rum colonies to a land of whiskey and mixed drinks. It wasn't just that we had grape problems and that beer easily went sour and was heavy to haul around. Distilled booze was, frankly, way less trouble to store and sell than fancy-pants wine, all too soon sour beer, and that cider just aching to become vinegar. This week, I'm going to cover this change and some shady whiskey developments. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that there was no such thing as aged whiskey or any distilled alcohol in the British colonies at the beginning of the 18th century, at least not on purpose. But, as I've mentioned on and off, it took a good long while for some things to travel from point A to point B in this new global trade network that had been building since the establishment of the 15th century spice trade. Long travel distances and times were mostly seen as a problem to overcome. Products that were unusually stable or ones that could be made so were the favored trade items of the time. A few items of such value that trying to move them around before they rotted, like pineapples and citrus fruits, were around. But for the most part, trade happened with things like furs and fabrics, precious metals and stones, dried spices and fruits, porcelain and wood, tea and cacao beans. Items that could sit in a warehouse or out on the dock for a few weeks, months, or even years as they made their way from harvest or workshop to the end consumer. Foodstuffs like flour, cheese, dried or pickled fish, and salt meats, dried peas, and beer were always a challenge to transport. It was a race against time, damp, bugs, rodents, and rot. If you remember from the last century, episode 37 on rum and the bonus distillation episode 42.5, the distilling of alcoholic beverages had been going on for a really long time, from at least the 800s BCE in the areas that are now China from millet and rice mashes. And there seems to be agreement that while a sort of distilling was observed in many places, doing it with a purpose and recipes and stuff seems to have traveled from Asia to Europe. And like other manufacturing methods of the time for stuff like metallurgy and silk making, the transfer of knowledge to Europe seems to have come larded with mystery. Facts were contained within stories, knowledge was jealously guarded, and almost nothing was written down, or if it was, such writings weren't spread around. Partly, yes, secrets, but also remember, paper was scarce. Literacy was limited and sometimes treated with suspicion. Oh yeah, and the world was definitely a jumble of languages, dialects, and alphabets. There weren't really many better ways for the spreading of ideas far and wide than simply directly telling people. So if something was a complicated operation, like distillation, it simply took a long time to learn, and not everyone was interested in that life. But those who were entranced by the process developed distillation into a tool for producing medicines, perfumes, and attempted to concoct mysterious elixirs of hermetic origin that just might confer fabulous and all but unobtainable powers. Some of them also came up with concoctions that contained opium, so for their time, maybe close enough. Anyway, distillation wandered about Europe and found its most orderly home in monasteries during that time of muddy record-keeping, sloppily named the Dark Ages. Important for our story are the homes made for distillation experts that were found in Ireland and in the Scottish Isles. Digging around in this topic, I was struck by the fates of Christian missionaries as they sailed north from the shores of France. The ones that ended up in these Gaelic lands established centers for the preservation of history, illumination, and distilling. But the legacy of the Christian missionaries to England were fights over orthodoxy and centuries of power struggles. The distilleries founded by Christian missionaries were well enough established and producing enough output that by the 12th century, when soldiers of Henry II invaded Ireland, they brought home tales of a fabulous ushkabaha, a name too soft and breathy for uncouth English mouths to master, especially after a dram or two. The noble name, Water of Life from the Gaelic tongue, was diminutivized to Whiskey, or the alternate spelling, Whiskey. I suppose that depends on your ingrained use of vowels. From their entry into Europe on into the 14th century, distilled liquors were mainly used in the manufacture of medicines. But then the bubonic plague happened, and lots of people went into the medicine-making business, some for help and hope, but for many it was simply a way to make money. The economic earthquakes of that era are a topic for other study, but if you're curious, read my favorite nonfiction work ever, A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century by Barbara Tuchman, for a great yarn and some interesting insights. With the increased distilled spirits output, liquors shifted from being only medicines to also being available for general drinking by rich people. Remember, stills and the expertise for distilling were still rather spare, so the ardent spirits weren't available at the corner store, but they were more available than ever before. To that point, the first recorded tax on alcohol showed up in a German state, and in the establishment of a precedent, the tax on the alcohol was levied not only for the purpose of raising funds for the state, but also apparently for the purposes of regulating and hopefully reducing the consumption of fruit brandies, which seemed to have reached worrisome levels. As metallurgy, manufacturing, and agricultural practices improved, by the 16th century distilled liquors would make the rest of the leap from medicine and a privilege of the rich to something the common people could access for their own ease. Not all the time, but the ardent spirits were trickling down to the common people. The skills of mashing, brewing, and distilling were found to be possible with a large variety of plant sources. Grain whiskies, fruit brandies, grape cognacs, and sugar cane syrup alcohols were all being developed, but there's no potato alcohol until the 19th century, so hold your horses. Monasteries with plenty of time on their hands were messing about with aging ales, wines, herbal liquors, and ardent spirits, especially the brandies and cognacs. But for most people, the imbibing of distilled liquors was done fresh out of the still, or out of the barrel as soon as it got there. So sure, there was a bit of whiskey circulating about England, but there was far more of this infused neutral grain spirit of what would become gin from the Low Countries that Elizabeth's England periodically fought against and with, and then against. In the 17th century, it became abundantly clear that distilled spirits and liquors were also excellent trade goods. In the colonies, it certainly all started with rum, but as grain growing got more successful with more farmers on more farms, and orchards were established and trade networks began to crisscross the colonies in the 18th century, other distilled liquors started to become important players in the colonial landscape. Rum still had a large presence in the colonies in the 18th century, but rum became more political and contentious as England started to get serious about enforcing a tax on molasses and worked very hard to discourage and then outlaw molasses coming from French and Dutch sources in the Caribbean. In the 18th century, drinkers started to take note of the difference in locally distilled rum and the varieties from the islands. Some of the first inklings of the advantages of aging alcohol may have started to occur to the colonists then. A fair amount of storing and even accidentally aging rum on these islands was done in charred barrels, for no one was ordering fresh, clean barrels for storing rum. They were just using cleaned-out barrels from other stuff that had arrived on the island. And if the previous contents had been too manky, charring was a great way to clean out any fishy or cheesy smells. I'm sure the flour barrels were fine. Also, the island rums would have gone through a bit of speed aging as they sat in the Caribbean sun and were agitated during their voyages to their ports of sale. The rums brewed and distilled in the colonies, especially Newport, Rhode Island, and Boston, would have lacked all these advantages and been quite raw, especially as they were typically consumed fresh. But rum remained the drink of the cities and of the coast. The coast because either the rum was imported from the Caribbean or the raw material, molasses, was. And of the cities because at this point all the cities worth the name were very close to the coast, or at least on a large river that got you to the sea pretty quick. Freight was nearly impossible overland right now. There was the ability to haul loads within a city and drive pigs and cows and such from outlying areas to a city, but the ability to haul wagon loads of barrels of just about anything was incredibly limited. And where there were roads for heavy loads, it was most often between a few dedicated places, like an iron mine, a smelter, and a forge. If you wanted to move really heavy stuff, you used water. Cognac was not noticeably present in the 18th century colonies. Sure, some was there. I've mentioned that there were rich people who ordered all sorts of things, but distilled, aged grape spirit was simply not on anyone's regular list. Brandy was around, some imported and some homemade. Apple, peach, and plum brandy were likely the most common, but fruit orchards were still small enough that most fruit was eaten fresh, cooked, and dried, or made into cider, though a fair bit was likely used to flavor shrubs, cobblers, and bounces, which I'll explain when we get to the mixed drinks next week. We've talked cider and briefly applejack, a highly alcoholic concoction made using a distillation by freezing process, the mixture of hard cider and cold nights. The main problem with freeze distilling is that all the congeners, that is, the products of yeast fermentation that are dissolved in with the ethanol and give you the worst part of hangovers, stay in there. So while the water, as crystals, is picked out of the hard cider, the ethanol, with its lower freezing temperature, stays liquid. But so does the methanol, the aldehydes, and all the ones, like acetone, which just sit there, waiting to attack your liver and your headache nerves. Anyway, applejack as a distilled or ardent spirit was about, but there was nothing couth about this drink. It would knock you over harder than fresh, unmixed rum. Between the popularity of apple cider, the usefulness of apple cider vinegar, and the increasing ability to make apple brandy, by the middle of the 18th century, applejack existed only on the fringes. If you really wanted to get drunk on the frontiers, and plenty of people did, there was a new, more popular contender on the block, and it didn't need to wait for the dead of winter to get made. This new brew was American whiskey. Different wars, land grabs and incursions, and religious squabbles and banishings had led to clusters of Irish, Scots, and Scots-Irish refugees and other troublemakers washing up on the colonial shores. They were generally no more welcome in the fresh new English metropolises growing up in the New World than they had been in the old ones on the home island. So these colonists of Gaelic descent headed out to the frontiers of this new land and scraped up a new living. In the more northerly colonies, they set up farms much like at home, often with a bit more ease as they had access to more wood and more space, but they had to adjust to growing more rye than barley and oats. In the colonies to the south, the grain that grew best was the alien Indian corn. In all cases, they had plenty of practice around how to store surplus grain in a damp climate where it was likely to mildew and spoil. It was time to make whiskey. The traditional whiskies of the British Isles are barley-based, exactly like its beer, though the farmhouse styles that proliferated also included wheat and oats as they were available. But out here, in the New World, barley was hard to come by, and what was grown was mostly rolled up into beer on the coasts. But rye and corn, these were relatively plentiful in their respective ranges. So Northern American whiskey tended to be rye-based, and Southern American whiskey was mostly made from corn, and both would add in whatever extra grains might be around. Oat whiskey never really took off, probably because oats weren't grown as much as other cereals, and the ones that were grown were too valuable and easy to use where they were as livestock food. At this point, just as with rum, there was no purposeful aging, and storage in charred barrels was an accident and a practicality. No one wanted to soak up the residue of a fishy barrel with their tediously made whiskey any more than they did with their rum. And so the benefits of letting fresh whiskey sit in a charred barrel were likely stumbled upon repeatedly before someone finally got the idea of doing it on purpose and in a controlled manner. It is worth noting at this point there was nothing called bourbon. There was corn whiskey and there was rye whiskey and there was just whiskey, but no bourbon. That will only happen after the United States of America forms. It takes a while. One thing that did exist in the 18th century colonies was something specifically and separately called ushkaba. It was to be found in the back of cookery books in the sections with things like medicines and remedies and potions and poisons and dyes and house cleaning mixtures. Just as we do now, the 18th century had a fascination with remedies of their past. Coming to a new country, upheaval in religious structures taught to you as a child, destabilization of the world order in learning, in government, and what history there was, See, there was a growing fascination with the ancient world or the classical world, so reaching back to legendary ideas and medicines of former days was very appealing. And one magic elixir people clung to was this ushkaba. Unlike the whiskey of the day, it was a full-fledged medicinal potion. The recipes definitely started with whiskey, or rum, or brandy, or aquavit, depending on your resources, or as Hannah Glass's 1765 recipe indicates, malt spirit, that is, any old distilled liquor. To that, a variety of dried fruits were added, raisins of the sun, figs, or dates. Spices, generally from the warming category, were also included, and recipes selected among nutmeg, cinnamon, caraway, ginger, cloves, and cubebs, which is a type of pepper. Licorice root was almost always included, and it might be sweetened with the addition of sugar. Depending on the source and the class of the brewer, it might also be finished with grand additions of saffron, and occasionally ambergris. The infused spirit was then strained after adequate steeping and then kept as a physic for upset stomachs, or in some places as a morning tonic, such as Amoros were in southern Europe. Ushkoba. Through time and distance and a name that became exotic, it had been granted mysterious healing powers. That isn't to say simple intoxication was disregarded for the power it had. In colonial society, the low alcoholic buzz of ciderkin, cider, barley water, and beer was just around, and it was so common as to go largely unremarked upon. And anyway, many of the alcoholic beverages consumed were closer to 3% ABV or even lower, enough to hold disease-causing creepy crawlies at bay and preserve calories so they might be taken on board by a thirsty, hard-working, agriculturally centered society, but not enough to cause noticeable drunkenness in most people. Distilled spirits were another thing entirely. The fast-arriving and sustained intoxication granted by the liquors with ABVs of 30% up to 60% alcohol was a rare or a new thing to most people in the 17th century. And though found more frequently, these high alcohol brews were still uncommon in the 18th century, and plenty of people saw them as dangerous and destructive. The temperance movement, moderation and reduction rather than prohibition, was already an idea in the air. Even the Bible repeatedly separates regular wine from strong drink. Wine had a definite, important, and useful role in the world, while the other should only be administered to people in great distress as a sort of medicine, or avoided outright. The 18th century was also when the interaction of whiskey and the Native Americans starts to become important. Again, 21st century scholarship has been a big help in clarifying and giving life to what had become a pat story in American history. The retelling I repeatedly received in the 20th century was some version of Indians had no fermented drinks or intoxicants, they tasted whiskey and acted like idiots, those poor, poor savages. Which is ridiculous on two main fronts. First, every civilization everywhere has access to and develops intoxicating substances and ceremonies around them. How quickly we forget the sources of tobacco and chocolate. Also, intoxicating substances up until about the 18th century almost always had some ceremony about them. Even in Europe, look at the practices of drinking chocolate, taking tea, coffee houses, and smoking rooms. Daily consumption of low-alcohol beer, cider, and kvass are considered exceptions here for their close relationship to food. But other than that, all these other intoxicants required a noticeable break in the day, partly because partaking in them was at least a little inconvenient. Not like now where I can pop a lozenge or chew gum that contains caffeine or nicotine or whatever while I go about my business. And many of these substances in their home ranges not only had ceremony about them, they might even be consumed in secret. Not secret as in nobody knew about it, but rather in the sense that it wasn't done publicly, and certainly not in a way that was shared with strangers, as in the colonists. The second problem with this view is that the bad decisions and suffering of these, quote, Indian savages, unquote, was somehow framed as unique. And this was rather amazing considering the piles of literature, cartoons, verse, and jests, not to mention condemnatory screeds written about the drunkenness of Europeans and colonists. Europeans were just as likely, in fact, probably more likely, to act like idiots when in contact with excessive amounts of distilled spirits. But we were somehow able to look down upon our own homegrown drunkards individually, without deciding that our entire society was poor drunken fools in thrall to this firewater. Native American societies had a similar range of reactions to whiskey on the frontiers as the colonists. They also spanned revulsion, temperate adoption for medicinal and celebratory uses, and all-out abuse. The main difference came in the way colonists and agents of fur and deerskin trading houses took advantage of tribal societies, paired with a desire to frame a savage them versus civilized us view of the situation. As I've been looking through the literature on fur, deerskin, and the pemmican trades, marked themes on why whiskey come through. Generally, Native American women had ownership of the processed goods they made. The most sought-after cured beaver pelts, tanned deer skins, and sweetest pemmicans were all laborious works of skill and a certain amount of luxury. Thus, they demanded high prices. There were multiple letters from these trading posts grumbling about having to deal with women and how their meticulous standards meant that trade was too slow and there simply wasn't enough throughput to meet the demands of the European market, much less expand the market for greater profits. A certain amount of speed and increased output was gained by the trade in firearms, and more importantly in black powder and ammunition. Also, trading agents started accepting and asking for raw goods. The uncured or minimally cured pelts and skin, and the raw ingredients of pemmican, not the finished product. Because these were unfinished and unprocessed items, they could often be offered for sale by the men who had hunted them, rather than by the women who had done processing. As agricultural agents will do later, firearms and ammunition were offered up front for a promise of so many pelts or skins later to pay off the loan. As you might realize, a trade in guns and ammunition, while a help to commerce, was also a way for tribes to even the score when it came to fights over land and hunting grounds. This was very frowned upon by the British government. Please see the French and Indian War for more details on one outcome of this. And the governments weren't the only ones not so happy about the trade in guns and ammunition. The trading agencies weren't fans either. These items were expensive imports. As the main currency of exchange, they really cut into profits. Yes, mirrors, needles, knives, blankets, and iron cookware were all good too, but as I said, those were also all imports and also cut into the profits. Whiskey, on the other hand, was a local agricultural product. Granted, it needed some processing, but like all good trade items, it was shelf stable. A long trip out to the frontier and time sitting in a storehouse didn't make it less valuable. And it had the added advantage of cutting into the good judgment of susceptible individuals. It wouldn't work on everyone. It just needed to work on enough people to disrupt a society. The communal nature of most tribal societies made the disruption of whiskey particularly troublesome. Since hunters could offer their unprocessed items directly to traders for the whiskey, including as future credit, this could disrupt the supply of meat and other items from the hunt making it to the tribes. Also, the promises of an individual could become the obligation of several people based on kinship ties, and of course there were other connections due to the complex societies these people lived in. Contemporary journals and letters usually reduced all of these family obligations and the societal complexity to quotes like, "A few hunters showed up with their squaws and children and dogs," unquote. Whiskey was regularly used to entangle Native Americans in the affairs of trading companies and to inveigle them into obligations that ended up as confusing land deals. This was really no different than getting young men drunk on city streets and impressing them into the Navy or merchant marine. But in one case, such misadventures were used to depict the character of an entire society as degenerate, while the other case was fodder for adventure stories, salacious cartoons, maybe angry letters, and, oh yeah, a war next century. Oh, okay. Bad decisions made while drunk lead to several wars, and I'm now getting off track. So where do we end up? The North American manufacture of rum and whiskey and its increasing availability were important players in the building of future America. It fueled sea trade and built coastal fortunes. Whiskey was an important element in the expansion of Western borders. It acted as a lubricant for social discourse and trade, as well as a cash stand-in in areas where there was a shortage of agreed-upon money. So that is almost all inland areas in the colonies. Yes, the colonial distilled spirits were technically food, but they were also a part of what anchored and built the economic system of the colonies. Like other foodstuffs such as flour and corn and saltfish and barreled pork, distilled spirits were defining the late colonial economy of the North American British colonies. Next week, it's time to look at how distilled spirits were drunk in the 18th century colonies. It's mix and match alcohols all around, and you'll understand why cocktails became so popular in the 19th century. We had already been making them without knowing it. Thanks for listening. And thank you to all of you who have left a review for this podcast, as well as to those of you who have reached out with questions and book suggestions. I never hate a source. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter, Insta, and Post.News bio at THOA Food and in the show description.